Max Albert and Pastor Joel Davis. I'm going to introduce Max first because with some help from Pastor Nash, he kind of helped originate the idea for this debate. They met recently and after some discussion decided that this might be an interesting topic to take up. So let me tell you a little bit about Max. He's a high school senior at Bridgewater Raritan High School. He's captain of the debate team. He was awarded the top speaker in the New Jersey Public Forum debate. He recently published a political essay titled, "Is Big Brother Watching You?" And I imagine he is tonight too. And he is an avid contrarian, he says. Max, I don't know whether you know that the Native Americans used to call a contrarian the person who disagreed with everything everybody else did. So much to the extent that contrarians in Native American tribes rode facing the rear end of the horse rather than the front.
I'm a moderator.
And his future plans include being a professor in comparative constitutional law. Please welcome Max Albert. On the other side, I had to spend the whole afternoon editing Joel Davis's bio down. He's lived a few more years than you, Max, so he's accumulated a longer list of participation in things and awards and all kinds of activities. But let me tell you at least the essential ingredients that make up Pastor Reverend Joel Davis. He holds a bachelor's degree in English and in education from what is now the College of New Jersey. He has a license to preach level in biblical studies from Global University and a master's degree in Christian counseling from Philadelphia Biblical University, now called Cairn University. He is an assistant vice president of finance at Pillar College, where he also serves as an adjunct instructor, having taught courses in psychology and counseling, literature, and biblical topics. He continues to conclude that the universe as we understand it is created by God. That's impressive, but Max, having spoken to you when we first came in, I know that you're not intimidated by all of this.
I'm the one who's apprehensive.
We decided ahead of time that we would begin with the affirmative position. Creationism is a sufficient worldview, and we will invite Reverend Davis to the podium to begin our debate.
Thank you, John. Thank you, friends and neighbors and brothers and sisters for joining us tonight, and thank you, Max, very much. And even during this process of getting ready for this evening, Max and I have been able to exchange some emails and things, and that's been a very pleasant and cordial experience, and I thank you.
All right, your time begins.
Creationism is a sufficient worldview. And the word worldview is the key word in that sentence, actually. A worldview is a filter. A worldview is a frame, it's a context through which we react with and interpret data. Everybody has a worldview, whether or not you're specifically conscious of operating within a worldview. A 4-year-old, for example, may have a worldview that mommy and daddy know everything and they feed me. And that's a sufficient worldview for that 4-year-old. Hopefully, as that 4-year-old grows and matures and accumulates more data, some of those assumptions become reevaluated, they get adjusted, and we develop a worldview as we go along. But by definition, a worldview often includes and always includes certain assumptions and things that we take for granted unless we intentionally take the time to examine them and to think about them and to allow ourselves to be challenged. And I assert to you this evening, one thing that I think of myself is that I do not believe the Bible casually. I don't believe the Bible out of habit. I don't believe the Bible because someone said I should. I have been saying, I'm a little bit older than Max, and that in and of itself doesn't prove anything. But I have read the book, I have studied it, but I've read a lot of other material too. I'm a fan of science, I am not a scientist, but this has been a topic that has been very close to my heart for quite a while. And what I've discovered, at least to my satisfaction, is that in all opposing worldviews, these assumptions that are used to draw conclusions often appear to be reasonable. They're not necessarily fantasies or unreasonable assumptions, but they are nevertheless assumptions. When we compare the biblical worldview to other worldviews, what I have found for myself is that the biblical worldview is the one that is the most satisfying, the most complete, the most comprehensive, and that helps me explain more about life than any other competing worldview. The naturalist worldview, the evolutionary worldview, if we want to call it that, really doesn't aim to address any of those questions. It's really just looking at describing or explaining physical material evidence and attributing origins to that. But the biblical worldview offers a narrative that not only provides a context for material information, for scientific data, but also speaks to things like consciousness and psyche and soul. The biblical worldview speaks to things like, why do we grieve when someone dies? Why do we expend great efforts to rescue people, comrades, citizens, soldiers who are left behind? Because there's something intrinsic in our understanding of the value of each human being. A materialistic worldview makes no contribution to that understanding at all. The materialistic worldview simply says we're here by accident. Richard Dawkins, when asked to explain how billions of years of mutations could result in human beings, the best he can say is, I guess we're just lucky. And that's essentially what it comes down to. And that doesn't satisfy me. But the question isn't just whether or not I like the truth. The question is whether or not science and scientific data as we understand it does or does not contribute to or does not undermine certain assumptions upon which I base my worldview. And again, I have come to the conclusion that the scientific data as we understand it, especially over the last 200 years as it's been accumulated more rapidly, has actually served to enforce the biblical worldview, to affirm the biblical worldview, and not undermine it. Not too long ago, the very first verse of the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, up until the early 1960s, that was a ridiculous comment, because the scientific community all understood that the universe, the cosmos, was itself eternal and infinite, and existed in a state called the steady state condition of the universe. The universe was in stasis. But along came various physicists, a Belgian physicist whose name is on the card on the table, so I don't remember it, who was the guy who actually introduced what we now call the Big Bang Theory. People observed that the galaxies are expanding, they're drifting away from one another. The universe is not static, the universe is in flux, the universe is constantly changing. And through various debates and study, the conclusion came about that the universe, lo and behold, the evidence indicates that the universe had a beginning. Now, how do we explain this? How do we explain what this data points to? Well, we must come up with a naturalist explanation. And so this beginning of the universe must have happened by some accidental naturalist means. But what I look at is, well, okay, there's a point we agree on. The universe had a beginning. My Bible says, in the beginning, God. The naturalist Bible says, in the beginning, whatever. But we agree that there was a beginning. And as the scientific data accumulates, what I find, is that the Bible and science ought never disagree. when it appears that the Bible and science disagree, either the science or the interpretation of the Bible are wrong. Everybody who says they understand the Bible, or everybody who has something to say about what the Bible says, isn't necessarily guaranteed to be interpreting what the Bible says correctly. And even as with science, as data accumulates and more information is gained, and the paradigm shifts and the model molds to fit the data, which is how the Big Bang Theory came about, by the way, well, so with biblical understanding. Up until last century, the Bible talks in a couple of places about a group of people called the Hittites. And the Israelites were fighting the Hittites, and the Hittites were warring with the Egyptians. Well, until 1890-something, that was a laughing matter as well, because no one had ever heard of the Hittites. Encyclopedias described the Hittites as a mythological tribe mentioned only in the Bible. Until 1893, when someone put a shovel in the ground in eastern Turkey and found the Hittites. Well, now that's no longer a joke. Actually, if you watch the History Channel, you can watch hours of programming about the Hittites and their chariots and how they warred with Egypt. So what I observe is that where I see incongruity between what the Bible says happened and, if you will, what science says happened, I've learned to wait a minute. Let's just wait a minute, because today's announcement, how many years ago was it announced that they've now proven, and it's always, we've now proven that the Bible is wrong and there is no God. We've analyzed the human genome, we've analyzed DNA, we have found all this junk DNA, and now we've decided that's proof of evolution because there's all this DNA that doesn't do anything, only for 2 years later for the announcement to be made, well, I guess not. Because now we found out that it hooks to the RNA and does all this stuff. I'm not going to run out and burn my Bible because some guy with a white coat stands up tomorrow morning and says that he's figured something new out. What I will do is reread my Bible to see if what this person has discovered or is asserting to have discovered makes sense within the context of this worldview. I will assert to you, and if we have time, we'll go through some details again. Science and the Bible need not disagree because they both describe reality. Reality is reality. You know, some people say, well, religion covers this and science covers that. Reality is reality. Reality flows from the throne of God and descends down into all these other dimensions. So if something's true, it will withstand scrutiny. Thank you.
You may applaud. And actually, Joe, you gifted us the 15 seconds. Now, please welcome Max Albert to the opposing view. Max, did you have an opening comment before you wanted to begin your presentation?
Hello, shalom, assalamu alaikum. I would first like to thank Pastor Nash and the entire congregation for proctoring this debate. In addition, John Bell for moderating and Reverend Davis for being a formidable opponent. That being said, let's begin. Observation 1, Plato notes the unexamined life is not worth living. In that sense, I hope tonight's debate acts as a catalyst for inward and external evaluation. Observation 2, tonight's debate ought not occur under any presuppositions. Essentially, Reverend Davis must first prove the truth value of the Bible prior to asserting it as evidence. In the same vein, one cannot prove the existence of Greek gods by utilizing the Iliad and the Odyssey. That being said, my approach will be twofold. First is an analysis of the human condition, and secondly and finally is going to be a deconstruction of creationist principles. Creationism presumes answers and consequently stifles the application of methods which have predictive capability. Steven Pinker, a neuropsychologist at Harvard University, explains that human beings are intrinsically inquisitive, leading to the indefinite rationalization of supernatural forces to explain the seemingly inexplicable. Thus, one can deduce that God was created in the image of man, not the other way around. Now, Voltaire takes this a step further and explains religion is the opiate of the masses, and the evidence is clear and present. All major monotheistic religions portray an anthropomorphic deity or a human-like God because it institutionalizes subservience. Now, historical evidence corroborates because when specific structures take away the reason to ask why and how, people align with those institutions which claim to know. In pre-Soviet Russia, Lenin established Christianity as the state religion. Christopher Hitchin notes that it's the willingness on behalf of the citizenry to adopt state religion which made Stalin's regime infinitely easier to establish. In that vein, creationism is not sufficient because it breeds individuals willing to be subordinate. Accompanying a willingness to follow is a perverse masochism of sorts, in which the human species is created sick and demanded to be well. An offensive proclamation which asserts moral rightness is attainable through a specific and absurdly mutually exclusive worldview. For example, the creation story of Islam and Christianity cannot feasibly coexist in a realm of truth. That exclusivity, by definition, creates the other. In essence, a divisive system, like creationism, sheds light upon the very fundamental motivation for the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, and modern-day jihad. Now, prior to discussing arguments which counteract creation-based misconceptions, one must first touch upon the barriers barring any rational proof of divine intervention. Firstly, creationism asserts God predates material, or what cosmologists refer to as quantum particles. As a brief exercise, I implore all of you to envision existence prior to birth. Such imagery is philosophically impossible to produce because human beings cannot conceive of nothingness. The implication, as Kant explains, is that one cannot claim what one cannot imagine. The assertion that God created the universe is logically flawed because prior to universal expansion, there was no temporal reality for God to exist within. Stephen Hawking explains, it's like looking for the edge of the earth. The earth is a sphere. It has no edge. So seeking for it is a futile exercise. Secondly, demanding for consistent patterns, such as all things must have a beginning, begs inquiry, namely, what created God? Immediately, creationism is reduced to an infinite regression which serves to disprove itself, in which we ask, who created the Creator? Finally, Valentinus, a Roman Christian philosopher who created creation ex nihilo, notes that when one contextualizes creation from nothing, it serves to imply an all-powerful God, which ought to be held to a standard of moral culpability. Thus, all atrocities ought to be weighed against this seemingly apathetic and implied totalitarian watcher. In doing so, God is no longer great and unjust. From such reality, Marcus Aurelius deduces that at very best, God is cruel, making belief insufficient. It is only after bypassing the aforementioned barriers one can even attempt to imply the existence of God. In doing so, the creationist must prove three things. Firstly, the cosmos is finely tuned, implying a creator. Secondly, hospitality to life is not an accident and serves purpose. Physicist Alexander Vilenkin notes and observes cosmic background radiation and concluded our universe is the production of a multiverse. In essence, a continuous system of universes which through the production of energy can produce other universes. The implication being, when you have an infinite span in universes, each with a predicted 1 to the septillion planets, at least one universe and one planet is bound to allow life to flourish. Now, in a more micro-analysis of terrestrial species, Science Daily explains that 99.9% of all distinct organisms ever to exist are currently extinct, leading one to believe that design or creation is far from intelligent or planned. Now, if you just analyze human beings, 99.7% of our earthly experience is consistent of an infant mortality rate ghastly to behold, leading one to believe God did not give me the right to life as a child 2,000 miles away dies of dysentery. Those two gigantic attainments, even if attainable to creationists, only get them as far as the implication of a God, or a deistic worldview. Creationism must then finally prove that such a deity takes an interest in human affairs. A theist must indicate rationally that God actually cares about the ingestion of pork, propitiations individuals make, the status of foreskin, and holds the following statement to be true. While AIDS may be bad, condoms are far worse. It is that clerical bullying that has resulted in millions of deaths and suffering in the continent of Africa alone. Richard Dawkins, makes the claim that the human species is almost 250,000 years old. And for 245,000 years of our existence, we only live to the age of 25, predominantly because of dental decay, ravenous animals, and bacterial diseases we didn't even know existed. And then God finally decides, after eons, belligerently, to start caring. And he figures the best way to do this is to send a human sacrifice to Bronze Age Palestine 248,000 years later, because that will cheer them up. If you reject such monotheistic storytelling, then creationism cannot be sufficient. In regards to morality, creationism must also hold that the Jews following Moses to the base of Mount Sinai believed rape, murder, perjury, and theft were morally permissible, only to reach the bottom of the mountain and be told, no, it's not kosher any longer. But modern biology actually corroborates and explains that our actions, our moral deeds, are a result of evolutionary altruism. Sam Harris, neuropsychologist at Stanford University, notes that human beings perform moral deeds as a result of our own self-interest. Essentially, acting morally is conducive to the existence of human beings. Essentially, the golden rule is a biological predisposition and does not derive from religious tenets. Albert Einstein puts it simply: I cannot imagine a God whose rewards and punishes the subjects of his creation and is but a reflection of human fertility. I ask you all to emancipate yourselves from this divine intervention, and you will be one step closer to freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Max. We will now proceed to a rebuttal period, which is 5 minutes long, and we will re-invite Pastor Reverend Davis to the microphone for the first rebuttal.
Don't call me Pastor Joel, that's
all right.
Well, what Max just did was a fine job of describing a fallen world. What Max just presented to us were all the reasons why the biblical model tells us what's going on in this world. God created the heavens and the earth as a perfect, flawless, painless place. It is because of man. In that sense, we agree with environmental radicals that man messes everything up. It is because of man, and we won't go into the details of that, but the Bible tells us that through disobedience, if you want to call it that, it really isn't disobedience so much as it was a lack of confidence in God. Through a lack of confidence in God, man chose to make their own decisions and to go their own way, and loosed upon the earth a degrading force that we call sin. Sin isn't moral. Sin isn't doing right and wrong. Sin is toxic waste. Imagine toxic waste being poured into someone's well in the backyard without them knowing about it. They would drink that water, they would be poisoned, their body would become corrupted, they may become sick without any knowledge as to why it's happening to them. And it's not because they're being punished or they did anything bad, it's because the water is poisoned. And that's the condition we all live in. This universe is poisoned. And God has set aside a redemptive plan so that mankind can be brought back into fellowship with God. Now, there's a presupposition that, well, we must prove that, we must be able to imagine nothing came from something. The reality is, if the biblical model is correct, we live in a multi-dimensional universe. We are not confined to time, space, and 3 dimensions. What the Bible tells us is that God is, I don't like the word supernatural. God is an extra-dimensional being. God exists outside and above this 3-dimensional reality. When man was created, we were in fellowship with God, and we could have fellowship with God, but that was all broken. What is enforced now by this human sacrifice that took place 2,000 years ago in Israel is that a door has been opened, a portal has been opened. Symbolically, the curtain in the temple that separates man from the holy place of God was torn, and we can reestablish fellowship with God. Part of what this means is that capacity we have to perceive God, to perceive this extra-dimensional reality, is being restored. Say, well, you know, what are you talking about? There's no possible corroboration of there being some kind of extra-dimensional reality. Well, if you talk to physicists up at Harvard and advocates of string theory, that's exactly what they believe that they're discovering. And I'm sorry, my timer must be wrong. So I'm done, right?
Yes.
I apologize. Thank you.
Okay, let's begin. So just start off with a few key observations. The first is going to be, don't let Pastor Joel pick and choose what science he wants to believe in. He comes up here and tells you that evolution is absolutely untrue, but then he supports string theory, which we know to be very shaky in terms of science. That's absolutely unacceptable. But secondly, he talks about a factual standard. Remember, he must meet that factual standard. He tells you this beautiful narrative of the Bible, but he never proves to you that the Bible itself is true, meaning those narratives have no implication in today's debate. So let's move to things he mentioned in his first speech. The first is going to be that all basal world assumptions, or all basal worldviews, make assumptions. First, the position I take is not a worldview, it's a rejection of a worldview. The implication is going to be, I don't make assumptions. I just say his assumptions are not correct. Nextly, furthermore, he talks about religion being able to explain more, and that's why it's consistent with his worldview. But the really important thing to note is you're going to be valuing quality over quantity. Yes, religion gives you a lot of very simple answers, but it doesn't give you any answers that are potent and that are consistent with factual science. But then finally, he talks about we both agree the universe has a beginning. And while that is true, he doesn't address the fact that the multiverse very well has the potential to be infinite, thus disproving the need for a God. Now, let's move into biology, because this entire debate hasn't really touched upon the tenets of evolution, which directly contradict creationism. So primarily, we know how this functions. We know that originally there was a body of water which had the correct properties. The body of water was then struck by lightning or some sort of energy that produced cells which formed into multicellular organisms. The multicellular organisms then engaged in a process of natural selection in which they produced into more complex organisms. This is supported by 98% of biologists, 90% of scientists, and the American Society for the Sciences. So the burden of proof lies on Pastor Joel's side. He must prove to you that evolution is untrue, rather than me proving to you that it is true. So furthermore, let's look to the moral aspect of creationism. He never actually addresses the fact that in order to prove creationism, you must prove the fact that God takes some stake in human affairs. He must prove to you that God rationally holds these statements to be true. And if he does, in fact, support creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, and a multidimensional God, hold that God to a standard of moral culpability. If he is all-powerful, he ought to be responsible for the actions which occur in his dominion. Thank you.
Gentlemen, I in error stopped Pastor Joel a little bit sooner than he should, and Max, you stopped a little sooner than you had time for. Each of you has an additional 2 minutes if you'd like to use them.
I'd like to use it.
Yeah,
Pastor? Yes, yes.
The assertion I have made from the beginning is that worldview filters data. Our worldview is the context within which we filter data. And Max has asserted over and over and over again that the points that are being made here are all based on assumptions. There's an assumption that one must prove that there is a God in order to entertain the reality of God. And that evolution doesn't need to be proved because so many people seem to agree on that assumption. But the reality is there are new bucket loads of assumptions that are built into those conclusions. Fancy words like gradualism, uniformitarianism, these types of things that assert, for example, the statement that the present is the key to the past. That assumes that everything for all eternity has always operated exactly as it does now. That's maybe a reasonable assertion, but it's not provable. And the biblical worldview asserts that that is not true, that we cannot extend infinitely into the past from today and reverse engineer necessarily everything that happened by applying the principles that are at work today. The second fallacy that Max introduces, that he is confusing what I'm going to call religion with a capital R. I agree with the statement that religion can be the opiate of the masses. But we're not talking about religion. We're talking about a God who is alive and who lives. Not a moral compass, not a moral demand, not a list of rules, but a living entity with whom we can have relationship and actually fellowship with. And there's a world of difference between how religion is abused, has been abused, and has been applied throughout the ages, throughout all cultures, and the reality of a living God who gives us the opportunity to know him personally.
Max, in your final 2 minutes.
Right. Okay, so let's begin with this living embodiment of God and the ability to connect with the divine being. I have interpretations, and I connect with the fairies. I connect with specific deities that I hold to be true that doesn't prove that they're factually accurate. But let's actually move to the science, because he says that uniformitarianism and gradualism are in fact untrue. Now, Albert Einstein says the beautiful thing about the laws of physics is that they are unchanging. But furthermore, you can actually look at the evidence. We see from the universal expansion, and Edward Hubble actually defined this in 1924, he applied the red shift to the expansion of the universe. We can extrapolate as a result of universal expansion that the universe has been expanding at an exponential speed. We know that. We can extrapolate backwards, thus proving uniformitarianism in the universal sense. But then furthermore, look to human beings in evolution. We can actually extrapolate this data backwards. We know that human beings evolved from Homo erectus, and Homo erectus evolved from an ancestor of the apes. This is extrapolating backwards, thus proving gradualism and uniformitarianism. But furthermore, look to the notion of religion being the opiate of the masses. So Pastor Joel agrees to this. But he says this is counteracted by a personal belief in God. But remember, it is this personal belief in God that enables people to use religion in heinous manners. So in order for him to believe that God takes a stake in human affairs, he must prove to you that God, for some reason that he has yet to mention, actually allows these actions to occur and doesn't stop them. Remember, my right to life cannot derive from God unless Pastor Joel also agrees that a child 2,000 miles away dies of dysentery because God allows it to occur. Thank you.
Our next period of time is a period for questions from the debaters for each other. And since we began with the affirmative position submitted by Reverend Davis, we will ask Max to ask the first question. Reverend Davis, you will have 3 minutes to respond.
Okay, so my first question is just going to be, how do you explain evolution in a biblical sense?
Pastor Davis.
When sin was loosed upon the universe, death entered the universe. According to the biblical worldview, there was no death before sin. What that means, because death is the engine of evolution. Without death, there can be no evolution. Evolution is built upon the presupposition of death, survival of the fittest, and these types of things. Since death entered the world at some unmeasured point in the past, in the biblical worldview, it is quite possible that changes have taken place. Changes have taken place all over the place. One of my sayings that I use among our youth here in church is that God didn't make German shepherds. There were no German shepherds in the Garden of Eden, if we want to think of it that way. German shepherds are a breed of dog that came about in 1893 because of a major in the Prussian army. So there's obviously change that has taken place and that takes place in the world we are in. Adaptation happens, species change. But that does not extrapolate backwards to origins. We agree that in terms of current populations, all the dogs on the earth, all the canines on the earth, descend from a common ancestor. Well, my view of that is that common ancestor is whatever the original canine was, the original canine kind that God created in the garden. And since sin and death has entered the world, there's been change. There's been evolution, if you will, not in the sense of new species being created, but certainly a sense of species going through change and adaptation. And that's true for everything living on the earth. As far as the injustices that Max refers to, those injustices exist, again, according to the biblical worldview, quite ironically, because of God's patience, not because of his indifference. Peter tells us in a letter that he wrote that a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day for God. And the reason that he forbears is because he is patient, that no one would be lost. He would want everyone to be brought to new life. So the day will come when God is going to stand up and fix all these injustices. God's going to blow the whistle, drop the flag, and call the end of game. And that's when everything gets fixed. I guess that's good news, bad news, depending on where you are when that flag goes down. Thank you.
Thank you. Give me applause. Our next question is from Pastor Joel to Max.
Thank you. In order to form, fossils require floods and very rapid burial. The entire planet is covered by billions of fossils buried in rock layers that are laid down by water all over the earth. Is it reasonable to believe that that's all the result of local events?
Yes.
I mean, like, in a more complex manner, we know that things don't just occur singularly. There's a result for all actions. That's physics, right? But we also know that this takes billions and billions of years, which is another example in which the Bible does not remain consistent with science. We know that specific interpretations of the Bible say that the earth is 6,000 years old, and they don't presuppose or even don't abide by the evidence which suggests it's billions of years old. We know that continental drift, for example, happens over a period of hundreds of millions of years. We know that fossil formation takes thousands upon thousands of years. So I'm not entirely sure what this question is about, like floods occurring in a singular manner, but like very simply to answer your question, yes, it occurs naturally. We know it occurs naturally. So this also reduces your argument to saying God allowed these floods to occur. And if God allows these floods to occur, then God allows for the death of millions. And once again, we're back at the beginning of my speech in which I say God is cruel, consequently making belief insufficient. So you can't have it both ways. Either you agree it's a natural process, or you agree that God allowed these floods to occur, and God allows natural disasters to occur, and additionally, God enforces these events to occur. So you have to adopt either worldview, and neither of them are very beautiful for creationism. Thanks.
Thank you. You may applaud. Before we start our second set of questions from our debaters, I'd like to remind all of you that if you have a question in mind, there are 3x5 cards at the end of the row. Please get one and write out your question. We'll collect them and we'll be able to address those questions to the debaters at the end of the formal part of the debate. All right, our next question comes from Max Albert. Max, you have a question for Reverend Davis.
Okay, so using some sort of historical or factual sociological evidence, how can you prove that the Bible itself is accurate? Because a lot of the statements you make presuppose that the Bible is factually accurate, and that's how you come to conclusions. So I would like to know, how do you reach the conclusion of biblical accuracy?
Pastor Davis.
Thank you. Well, that is an age-old question. And as I noted before, the Bible has been examined in some circles, ridiculed and mocked over the centuries for the assertions that it makes. But over and over and over again, the Bible ends up standing on its own 2 feet and being affirmed. I mentioned before the one example of the Hittites. That's only one of many, many examples. Archaeologically, biologically, geologically, the evidence for the biblical worldview is upheld over and over again. Max raises the questions of biology, and he keeps saying things like, we know it takes billions of years. We know that people are descended from this and that and the other thing. And we don't know those things. These are conclusions that are reached based on examination of certain data, and also based on assumptions that are made given a certain worldview, which is the naturalistic, atheistic worldview. If there is no God and I need to concoct an explanation for the data, I can come up with any story I want and call it reasonable. But none of the data actually undermines the Bible story. It, in fact, enforces it. For example, racism. Up until, again, the studies of DNA, the evolutionary point of view was that skin color was an indication of evolutionary progress. Lighter-skinned people were more advanced than dark people. And even in the famous monkey trial, John Scope's biology book called A Civic Biology, there were tables that were printed showing the ascendancy of races. Well, the blacks were at the bottom, and then kind of came the Indians, and then the Asians were up here, and the whites were at the top, because they were writing the books. But the fact of the matter is, the biblical worldview throughout history has affirmed that the human race is one race, that we all descend from a common set of ancestors. We've got one mother and father, if you want to take that description. And my view is that, lo and behold, Scientific America prints a magazine that says on the cover, does race even exist? Well, the Bible has been asserting that for thousands of years. And I really don't want, I'm not going to agree with the scientists who say, well, blacks are not as advanced as whites evolutionarily because we've made certain observations that are superficial and ethnocentric. The Bible assertion has, as far as I'm concerned, been quite nicely upheld by modern biology.
You didn't wait for me to give you permission that time. Final round of questioning goes to a question from Reverend Davis to Max Albert.
Thank you. What is consciousness?
We don't know, right? But that's the beautiful thing about science is I'm willing to say I don't know. I don't come to the game with answers. Science tries to prove these things, but if we don't prove them, that doesn't mean science is accurate. Or rather, that doesn't mean that science has some flaw. It means that science needs to keep working. That's the difference between the Bible and science. The Bible says we know, and we've known these things for 2,000 years, whereas science is constantly evolving. So this actually links perfectly into what you were just talking about in terms of evolutionary racism. So at first, evolution never actually proclaimed these ideas. They just said that race and skin color is indicative of where individuals once resided, essentially their homelands. And then these conclusions, even if they were made by some flawed scientists, doesn't disprove the science. We've evolved from that. We know that these ideas are not true. But science is willing to reform, religion is not. And so you talk about how religion and science often meet and intersect. But you say if religion and science diverge, it's just a result of the religious interpretation. This is rather an example of religion catching up to science, not the other way around. But look to the argument of the God of the gaps, which says, religion once claimed millions of gods. Now we claim one. That is a progress of a kind we are ever moving closer to the true number. But really what's occurring is science claims an explanation for a number of things like the sun rising. And then we come up with explanations, scientific explanations, and science no longer claims the sun rises because of a wolf god. Rather, science says, okay, fine, God doesn't make the sun rise. And this is constantly occurring. Science is willing to be wrong, religion is not.
Thank you, Matt. Before we go into our final closing statements from our two debaters, let me remind you once again that if you have a question that you would like to ask either one of the debaters, that you get one of the 3x5 cards, write your question on the card, and in the upper right-hand corner, if you want to address that question to a specific person, put the debater's name in the upper right-hand corner. Otherwise, the question will be posed to two of them, so they both have an opportunity to answer. Are there any questions on that? The cards are at the end of your aisle, and we'll be collecting them after the final debate responses. The next part of our debate is a 3-minute final remark period for each of the debaters. We began with the affirmative. We will close with the negative. So, Max, you will have an opportunity to present first your 3-minute final remarks.
Okay, let's start with first a brief definition of what sufficient really is. Sufficient diverges into morality and factual accuracy. Unless Pastor Joel can prove both of those, you ought not hold the statement that creationism is a sufficient worldview. So in terms of morality, Pastor Joel says that religion can be used for harm, but oftentimes as a result of some personal connection, it's used for good. So first, analyze that this harm that's produced by religion greatly outweighs the good. An individual life being made better is not as sufficient to negate as individual life being lost, because the ability to live always precedes the ability to enjoy life, so you're always going to be weighing death prior to anything else. And as I said, creationism, as a result of this exclusivity, breeds individuals willing to be subordinate and willing to engage in modern-day jihad, prior crusades, and the Spanish Inquisition. So let's move to this notion of factual accuracy, which ultimately is going to determine who wins this debate. Firstly, in terms of philosophy, he never addresses the infinite regression produced by God, or even the notion that we can't conceive of a temporal reality which existed prior to Earth because it wasn't there. God had no room to exist within. But furthermore, in terms of evolution, Pastor Joel tells you that evolution ought not be believed because it's being presented to you by men in white coats. Well, you can hold the exact same statement for religion. But the difference is, evolution is willing to alter its views. We know exactly that evolution is true because we can observe it in our everyday lives. We know that we ought not take too many antibiotics because viruses adapt and evolve. We also can look at specific skeletons of Homo erectus, which we know that we have evolved from. Evolution is a fact. The Bible attempts to catch up to that fact through specific interpretations. But the most important in today's debate is ultimately going to come down to that philosophical application, because ultimately neither of us have all of the scientific facts. But remember, you cannot hold creationism to be true insofar as it leads to an infinite regression. Because if you make the claim that something cannot derive from nothing, then you have to apply that to God as well, in which you engage in this question, who created God and who created the creator of God? Ultimately, you cannot reach these conclusions. Insofar as that is accurate, then creationism is not sufficient. But remember, all of the science is on our side. It specifically tells you evolution is the case. But what Pastor Joel fails to prove to you is that God takes a stake in human affairs. If he doesn't do that, he only proves deism. He does not prove creationism, and he does not prove theism. Ultimately, this entire debate has revolved around an attempt to prove a deistic worldview, in which God created the universe, not a theistic worldview, in which God actually takes some sort of stake in human lives. Thank you.
Now, brief closing remarks, Reverend Davis. 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. As a Christian, which is the religion I embrace, God certainly has taken a stake in human affairs. He sent his son to die for us. Now, one would say that's barbaric, how can that make any sense, and so on. And without going, because we don't have time to go through all that, but that is the stake God has. He has paid an enormous price to open an enormous door that we can enter through to regain fellowship with him. Now, Max asserts that I need to prove that God exists. And I can only assert to you that I experience God. So I'm testifying to you that I personally have a relationship with this God. And I can cite all kinds of examples. But I'm going to try to give you a very quick example that may illuminate where I'm coming from. Because God does not exist within the confines of our temporal universe. He doesn't pre-exist time. He exists outside of time. Imagine a painting. A painting is a two-dimensional space, if I can say that. And a painter, who is a three-dimensional being, can pick up a brush and dab colors onto that canvas and create an image. But the painter is not trapped inside the image. The painter is outside the image. And the painter can take his brush and dab and bang, there's a cloud. And if there were beings who lived on the surface of that painting, they might think a miracle just happened, because they're trapped inside the time and space continuum of their little flat painting. We are trapped within the time and space continuum of our three-dimensional world. But God is the painter. How does he exist? I can't define that, because he exists above and beyond and outside this temporal reality. But I was created by God in his image, and on the day that I was created, meaning mankind, he created in me a facility to relate to him, to perceive him, and to actually see him. The Bible tells us that Adam and Eve could visit with God when they were walking on the face of the earth, because they had a facility to transcend time-space and interact with God in these extra-dimensional realities. I would ask you to indulge in a thought experiment and imagine what would happen if by some genetic mutation all human beings gradually became colorblind and we lost all perception of color just genetically. What would 8, 10 generations from now say about our literature that defines red, blue, and green? They'd say, what were these people hallucinating about? Because they lost the ability to perceive color. We have largely lost the ability to perceive spirit. We've lost the ability to perceive God, and we're colorblind. But he can restore that vision. He can touch us and replace that which was broken, and that's how I know he exists.
Thank you. Once again, can we have a round of applause for both of our debaters? While they catch their breaths, Jake, would you collect the cards? If you have a question on a card, please raise your hand and Jake will collect it. Both of these men have done an excellent job tonight. We really appreciate the effort of everyone. We'll try to get into as many questions as we can. Would both of you agree to a 3-minute response to whatever question you are asked?
That's fine.
Sure. Does that work for both of you? Some of the questions will be directed to one or the other. Some will be for both comments.
Maybe Jake could make a second pass. Select the ones you've got.
Looks like we have a bunch of questions. Now may we have a round of applause for Jake, who was dragged. We're obviously not going to be able to get to all of these, but we'll try to get a sampling of the kinds of questions that were addressed. Let's see. Some of your handwriting is like mine. Let's see if I can find a couple that I can read. Master, would you do me a favor? These 80-year-old guys need those glasses. Thank you. You guys must all be doctors. That's better. Good. First question for Max. Regarding proof, do you not consider it to be proof of the veracity of the Bible that hundreds of prophecies made about the life of Christ over millions came true in the life of Christ? You have 3 minutes.
Okay, so insofar as these prophecies were prescribed in the Bible, that's just circular reasoning. It's saying the Bible is accurate because the Bible said that it's accurate. This is no sort of proof. But even if you look to the accounts of Jesus' life, they all differ. They all have different perspectives. None of them tell the exact same narrative, leading one to conclude either the Bible is incorrect or that Jesus' life perhaps did not abide by these specific tenets listed within. So very simply, hundreds of prophecies do not prove anything to be accurate. That is what we call myths, mythology, folklore, tales. That is a literal narrative. It is not, by definition, proof of the existence of God. So that would be my answer, that prophecies are just indicative of mythology.
Thank you. A question for Pastor Davis. You pointed out that factors of the Bible are true, but the same is true of the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, and even Harry Potter. Just because some aspects are true, it does not mean that all are. So once again, how can one prove the validity of the Bible and the existence of God without entering into a circular paradox?
Well, that is itself true. The Bible never claims to be the repository of all truth. There's a wonderful parable in the Bible that I happen to like. It's called the parable of the pearl merchant. And Jesus said there was a man who was a buyer and seller of pearls. And on one of his trips, he came across what he called the pearl of great price. And recognizing the value of that great pearl, sold everything else that he had in order to raise the funds to purchase that one great pearl. What I like about this metaphor, this parable, is that first of all, a pearl merchant is someone who becomes skilled. They become skilled in analyzing the pearls and recognizing the value, looking for flaws, and so on. Now we have expressions, even in our language, we refer to pearls of wisdom and so on. And so I make a connection here, if you will, that there are pearls of wisdom, there are pearls of information. Just because someone who doesn't agree with me says it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon doesn't make them wrong. It may very well be 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But what I find in Scripture, in terms of the amazing consistency of these writings, we have to keep in mind that the Old Testament is a collection of books that were written over a period of about 15 to 1800 years, pretty much located in a single area around Israel, Palestine, by a group of people. The New Testament is another collection of books that were written over a period of about 30 to 40 years, but spread out all over the whole Mediterranean basin. When Mark was writing his gospel and when Luke was writing his gospel, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have email, they weren't comparing notes with one another. They were compiling narratives that were from eyewitnesses, from people who participated in these events. These gospel narratives were written only within 20 to 30 years after Jesus' life. And what I find in Scripture that impresses me, among other things, is that its own internal integrity, that it hangs together from beginning to end. The beginning of the narrative that starts in Genesis is carried through to consummation at the end of Revelation with an amazing consistency. Does that prove that the Bible is correct in and of itself? Probably not. But does it witness to the validity and the testimony and integrity of the book? It absolutely does.
Thank you. Question for you, Max. What would serve as evidence of an intervening God if you were asserting that there is no evidence of this?
So first, in a biblical sense, I'd like some narrative to even be factually accurate. For example, this notion of the virgin birth. Thomas Paine poses the question, which is more likely, that the laws of physics be suspended, or that a Jewish minx tells a lie? So the burden of proof ultimately lies with the individual making these claims. So for me, what's sufficient as evidence is some proof, some narrative indicative of God that is consistent with factual knowledge and accuracy and our observations. But furthermore, there has been no proof whatsoever that this creationism, which is even more so than claiming that God exists, claims that God induced evolution and that God currently has a stake in human affairs and allows evolution to occur. There is no evidence of this. The evidence I would like is some primal interruption in evolution, some even notion of original species in the Garden of Eden being the primal base for evolution. Because a recent study published by Richard Dawkins notes that with the amount of speciation we currently see, that narrative cannot be correct. There are far too many species for this original notion of evolution to occur. So I would like some factual consistency and some narrative that is consistent with our scientific knowledge.
Next question for Pastor. You said that creationism is a sufficient worldview because it answers more questions. But what is the point of false answers? The beauty of science is that it exists exclusive of our belief in it. Science simply accepts that we don't know all the answers, but are in the process of finding them. Religion instead proposes answers but without proof. So are wrong answers better than no answers?
Good question, and absolutely not. And some of the types of injustices and abuses and things that Max is citing and lamenting perhaps are the result of bad answers rather than true answers. Man can construct systems and religions to serve his own needs, and those things are not necessarily comments upon the validity of the Word of God and the message of Jesus Christ. Could you reread the last sentence?
The last sentence
In the
was...
question, I'm sorry.
Oops.
Oops. Am I losing time?
Oh, here we go. So are wrong answers better than no answers?
No, wrong answers are not better than no answers. And I shared before a little quip, I share with some of my students, God didn't make German shepherds. The Bible, the church, Sunday school are perfectly capable of making people repeat platitudes that have no basis in fact, that can't be demonstrated. God didn't make everything we see. The world we live in now is fallen and corrupt. The injustice that we lament, the fact that we even lament injustice is, to me, an echo of the fact that we intuitively have an understanding that things should not be as they are. Things are bad, and we don't like it, and we know we don't like it. If evolution is the way life came about, if we're all just happy accidents, there's no explanation for grief. There's no explanation for why we mourn when people die. There's no explanation for soul, for psyches. Max said we can't explain consciousness. I can explain consciousness. God breathed the soul into mankind when he created man with his own hands. God made us in his image, which means we have consciousness because God made us this way, that we may perceive him, interact with him, and know his ways. No, a bad answer is not better than no answer, but to presume that, well, science always gives good answers. We've gone through a litany of examples this evening of how science changes. They're continually changing because they're gathering new data. Well, believers do that too. My faith has changed over the last 30 or 40 years enormously, from kind of a Sunday school version to what I hope is a much more informed version. Partly because of what I've learned from experience, partly because of what's been discerned in the universe. But to assert that science always has the right answer is both naive and foolish.
Thank you. afraid we're going to only have time for one more set of questions for each of you. We have an incredible list of great questions here. We keep us here all night, but we're not going to impose all of that on you. Max, for your final response to a question, do you believe in a transcendent moral standard? And if you do, you seem to hold the Christian God to a moral standard of cruelty, but did not shed light on where you believe that standard comes from.
I do believe I did shed light upon where that standard comes from. I give a very clear narrative and biological evidence of evolutionary altruism. We do things because they are conducive to our self-interest, to repercussion. Like, if we engage in actions that are harmful, if I kill someone, I know that I face an action which may impede my ability to live. That is where the standard occurs. I don't believe in an objective moral standard. I don't believe in the standards set aside by the Ten Commandments, because ultimately, a large majority of them are asking you to praise this God, a seemingly jealous God, and they hold adultery on the same level of murder. So, the objective standards laid out in the Bible I do not agree with. I do believe in a subjective value of morality, and I'm holding God to that standard. God does not allow for the elongation of human life. I value that above everything, as I said in my closing argument. Life ought to be weighed above everything, and insofar as God, a seemingly powerful deity, allows this to occur, I would say that is a harmful thing. So ultimately, once again, these standards are deduced by human beings as a result of evolution. We know this to be true, and we know that the sociological evidence is intuitive. The golden rule ought not be taught by religious values, but rather is a biological predisposition. We don't harm other people because we fear that they will harm us.
Thank you. Final question. The final question for you, Pastor. Why did God allow sin and death to enter the world?
Challenging question, and what that asks is that we discern the heart and the motives of God. I think the standard answer to that is that God allows free will. He even allows free will, and again, I'm referring to the biblical model and the Bible as my source. But he even allows free will in heaven. In contrast to what Max is asserting, God does not limit creativity. He does not limit thinking. And just some examples, Isaac Newton, for example, who was certainly held in the esteem as being the greatest scientist of all time until the 20th century with Einstein, with his basic laws of physics and so on, was a creationist and a Christian. Not in spite of, but in addition to his amazing contributions to science, mathematics, calculus, and so on, Isaac Newton himself thought that his greatest work were the works he did on Bible prophecy and examining the Bible and talking about Revelation and the ends of the world and so on. So why did God allow sin and death to enter the world? It was because of his respect, if you will, for free will. When sin and death entered the world, and the things about which we're talking tonight, Max just said that life should be extended. Well, that is exactly God's plan. God talks about eternal life. Death is the engine of evolution. Without death, evolution doesn't work. And as a worldview, evolution, the best evolution can produce as a worldview. And I'm not saying there's no change, there's no adaptation, I'm not saying species don't undergo stress, but as a worldview in terms of attributing origins, the best evolution can come up with is, well, we must have some altruistic gene that helps us preserve our species so that our genes can be passed on. Well, the biblical worldview suggests quite the opposite, that our love for justice, our grief over injustice, our desire to see beauty and goodness in the world are all echoes of the image of God that has been created in each one of us through God's divine act. And we testify every time we grieve, we testify every time we lament justice, that there is some higher consciousness that is describing for us how things ought to be compared to what we are experiencing. If what we are experiencing is merely the result of a long line of happenstance, I don't understand regret.
Thank you. I think everyone will admit that our debaters tonight did an excellent job. Both of them represented their viewpoints splendidly. It's obvious they've spent a great deal of time researching the topic and thinking about it seriously. And as I said at the beginning, we were not looking for a winner or a loser tonight. We were looking for an opportunity to expand our own understanding and to grow as human beings in the knowledge of the questions that we debate on subjects like this. We hope that you'll be participants in our series of the great debates. Tonight, I think, was an auspicious beginning. We hope that the next debates that we present to you will be as interesting and as educational. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your incredible participation. Please come back again for the next one. Pastor Davis, Max Albert, thank you both.